The harbour below was so densely packed with vessels that water was barely visible between the hulls, as squadron leader John Fouquier circled his Bristol Blenheim bomber at 8,000 feet above Dunkirk on the night of September 7, 1940, at precisely 9:47 p.m. Observing through breaks in the clouds a scene that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, when this same harbour had been the site of the miraculous evacuation that saved the British Expeditionary Force. Now, instead of British soldiers being rescued from the beaches, German invasion barges crowded every available anchorage, with dozens of vessels crammed bow to stern and side by side in a concentration that represented Germany's ambitions to cross the English Channel and conquer Britain through amphibious assault. Fouquier counted quickly with the practiced eye of an experienced bomber pilot who understood the importance of accurate target assessment, identifying 47 vessels in the inner harbour, along with at least 30 more in the outer anchorage. And through breaks in the cloud cover, he could see additional vessels arriving in a steady stream from the east, from Belgium and Holland and Germany, all converging on this critical assembly point. This was Operation Sea Lion made manifest. Hitler's invasion fleet concentrated in a handful of French and Belgian ports where the vessels were vulnerable and exposed, presenting perfect targets for the RAF bombers that had been tasked with destroying Germany's amphibious capability before it could be used to transport Wehrmacht soldiers across the Channel to English beaches. Fouquier keyed his radio with calm professionalism that belied the danger they were about to face, ordering all aircraft to begin their attack run and follow his lead while targeting the barges for maximum damage. And 6 Blenheims followed him down in a diving attack from 8,000 feet to 3,000, the altitude at which they would release their bombs. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately with German gunners who had learned their craft through months of war, demonstrating their skill, filling the sky with flak bursts that appeared as black puffs expanding dangerously close to the attacking bombers. And one Blenheim took a direct hit almost immediately, staggering in mid-air before falling away, trailing smoke that marked its death spiral toward the dark waters below. But the other 5 aircraft pressed on toward their release altitude with the determination that characterized RAF operations throughout the Battle of Britain. And Fouquier's bombardier called out the critical announcement that bombs were away, releasing 4 500-pound bombs that fell tumbling through the air before stabilizing and accelerating toward the packed harbour below. The bombs hit with devastating effect that exceeded even optimistic predictions, with 2 bombs striking barges directly and producing massive explosions that disintegrated the wooden vessels completely, not just sinking them, but literally vaporizing them in fireballs that could be seen for miles, while a 3rd bomb hit a cargo ship loaded with fuel drums that exploded with a fireball 300 feet high. The shockwave from that detonation flipping 2 adjacent barges completely upside down so they sank in seconds. The 4th bomb landed in the water between 3 barges, and the underwater explosion lifted all 3 vessels simultaneously as the pressure wave transmitted through the incompressible water medium struck their hulls with tremendous force, buckling and cracking the structures so they flooded rapidly and all 3 sank within minutes, contributing to a total of 7 vessels destroyed in this single attack that lasted approximately 1 minute of actual bombing. Fouquier's Blenheim pulled up sharply to climb away from the flak and escape toward home, leaving behind a scene of devastation as Dunkirk harbour burned with fires that would be visible from the English coast across the Channel. 7 critical components of the invasion fleet destroyed in 60 seconds of concentrated bombing that represented just the beginning of a campaign that would ultimately involve 267 raids against invasion ports over the next 6 weeks. The strategic context that made this bombing campaign necessary began on July 16, 1940, when Adolf Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for the invasion of Great Britain under the code name Unternehmen Sea Löwe, Operation Sea Lion, at a moment when Germany's strategic position seemed overwhelmingly advantageous. Germany controlled France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, and Denmark, essentially all of Western Europe except Britain, and the British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, but without their heavy equipment, leaving 200,000 men safely in Britain, but without tanks, artillery, or transport vehicles that had been abandoned on French beaches. Britain was isolated and alone and apparently vulnerable, making Hitler's invasion plan seem straightforward in concept if complex in execution, with the objective being to land 160,000 troops on the southern coast of England between Brighton and Folkestone, establish beachheads, push inland toward London, and force British surrender through military occupation of the capital. The plan was simple in outline, but faced one enormous obstacle that would prove nearly insurmountable, namely the English Channel itself, 21 miles of water at its narrowest point that was controlled by the Royal Navy and defended by the RAF and swept by powerful tides and subject to unpredictable weather that could change from calm to violent within hours. Crossing the channel required massive amphibious capability, including specialized landing craft, transport ships, escorts, air cover, and logistics coordination of a type that Germany simply didn't possess, having developed no amphibious warfare doctrine, no specialized landing craft, and no experience with large-scale beach assaults of the type the operation would require. The Kriegsmarine was ordered to assemble an invasion fleet within 6 weeks, with Admiral Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy receiving instructions that by September 15th, the fleet must be ready to transport 160,000 men plus their tanks, artillery, trucks, horses, supplies, and ammunition across the channel. Raeder understood immediately that the task was essentially impossible, given the time frame and resources available. But military orders are not subject to negotiation, so he began requisitioning every available vessel from Germany and occupied territories, taking barges and tugs and fishing boats and cargo ships and river steamers, essentially anything that could float and might conceivably carry troops across water. The target was 1,700 vessels, a number that seemed astronomical given that Germany's maritime resources were primarily oriented toward river and coastal transport, rather than amphibious assault. So the requisition program expanded to occupied countries with France, Belgium, and Holland, being systematically stripped of every barge from every inland waterway, every river port, and every canal system. By August, the requisition had devastated European commerce in ways that would have peacetime economic consequences, leaving the Rhine empty of traffic, the Seine devoid of barges, and the canal systems of Belgium completely drained of transport capacity, with every single barge having been seized and towed to French and Belgian ports for conversion to military use. These weren't purpose-built military vessels, but rather cargo barges designed for rivers and calm water, flat-bottomed craft meant for the placid conditions of inland waterways rather than the challenging environment of open sea with waves and currents and tides that would make channel crossings extremely hazardous, even in good weather. German engineers worked frantically to modify these civilian vessels for military purposes, adding ramps for equipment loading, reinforcing hulls to withstand wave action, and installing engines in some barges while accepting that most would need to be towed across the channel by tugs in good weather at night, while hoping desperately that the Royal Navy wouldn't find them during the crossing. It was a desperate plan created from desperation, the only plan available given Germany's lack of proper amphibious warfare capabilities, but it represented Germany's best hope for conquering Britain and ending the war in the West. Meanwhile, in London, on August 1, 1940, Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal reviewed reconnaissance photographs taken over French ports, including Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk, Le Havre, Dieppe, and Ostend. And the photographs revealed something alarming in their clarity and unmistakable implications. Barges, hundreds of them, were concentrated in every port within 100 miles of England. Not scattered randomly, but organized deliberately. Lined up systematically, obviously being prepared for some major operation that could only be an invasion attempt. RAF intelligence analyzed the photographs and estimated numbers that grew more concerning with each reconnaissance flight, with at least 400 barges already assembled and more arriving daily, projecting that by September there might be 800 or possibly 1,000 vessels gathered in the invasion ports. Portal understood the strategic situation immediately with the clarity that had made him one of Britain's most capable military leaders, recognizing that these barges would carry German troops across the Channel if the invasion proceeded, making them the single most critical component of Operation Sea Lion, and therefore the highest priority target for RAF Bomber Command. He summoned his staff and explained with characteristic directness that they faced a target-rich environment with multiple ports containing multiple vessels packed closely together with minimal defenses compared to targets in Germany itself, creating an opportunity to destroy as many invasion barges as possible before they could sail for English beaches. The plan was operationally simple, though tactically dangerous, requiring nightly bombing raids using every available bomber to target the ports and sink the barges while disrupting German preparations for the invasion. Bomber Command committed everything to this campaign, including Wellingtons, Hamptons, Whitleys, Blenheims, and Battles. Essentially, every operational aircraft available, with some squadrons flying 2 missions per night to maximize the pressure on German invasion preparations. The first major raid was scheduled for August 13th, with Boulogne Harbour selected as the initial target, and the objective being maximum destruction of assembled barges. On August 13, 1940, at 11:47 p.m., 12 Wellington bombers approached Boulogne from the north at an altitude of 10,000 feet under clear weather conditions with excellent visibility that made the harbour clearly visible below, packed with barges in a concentration that seemed almost absurdly target-rich to the bombardiers preparing their attacks. The German flak batteries opened fire immediately with experienced gunners manning 80mm guns that had proven their effectiveness in previous engagements, filling the night sky with bursting shells and tracers arcing upward. And 2 Wellingtons were hit almost immediately, with one exploding in a fireball that marked the instant death of its crew, while the other staggered and lost altitude before crashing into the sea 5 miles offshore. But the remaining 10 aircraft pressed on with bomb doors opening and bombardiers acquiring targets and releasing 60 500-pound general-purpose high-explosive bombs that fell in clusters toward the harbour below. The first wave of bombs landed among the barges, producing direct hits that disintegrated the wooden vessels in massive explosions and fires, with secondary explosions following as fuel tanks ruptured and ignited, while the second wave hit the docks themselves, destroying cranes and obliterating warehouses that contained supplies and equipment needed to load and launch the barges. Even the third wave that landed in the water proved effective because the explosions created underwater pressure waves and shock waves that cracked hulls and ruptured seams, causing barges to take on water and sink slowly or list heavily enough to become unusable for the invasion mission. The Wellingtons turned away toward home, leaving Boulogne Harbour burning behind them, with 14 barges destroyed and 8 damaged, 2 cranes destroyed and 1 warehouse obliterated. The entire mission lasting 47 minutes from first approach to final departure. British losses totaled 2 aircraft, with 18 crew members killed. while German losses included 14 barges permanently destroyed, plus 32 dockworkers killed and hundreds of tons of supplies destroyed, creating a casualty ratio that would prove characteristic of the campaign as RAF losses remained sustainable, while German invasion preparations suffered increasingly severe disruption. The attacks continued with relentless regularity through August and September, as Bomber Command maintained pressure on every invasion port, with raids on August 14th targeting Calais and destroying 20 barges, August 15th hitting Dunkirk with 18 barges destroyed, August 16th striking Ostend with 23 barges lost, and August 17th attacking Le Havre with 15 barges sent to the bottom. The pattern repeated night after night, with German workers scrambling to repair damage and replace destroyed vessels, while RAF bombers returned again and again, creating a grinding war of attrition where Germany struggled to maintain the fleet size necessary for invasion, while Britain systematically destroyed vessels faster than they could be replaced. By early September, the cumulative damage to the invasion fleet had become severe enough to impact German planning in fundamental ways, with Admiral Raeder reporting to Hitler that the assembled fleet numbered fewer than 1,000 vessels instead of the required 1,700, representing a shortfall that would make the planned invasion impossible unless addressed. The RAF bombing campaign had destroyed or damaged enough barges to create a transportation capacity deficit that couldn't be solved simply by requisitioning more vessels, because essentially every available barge in German-controlled territory had already been seized, leaving no reserves from which to draw replacements. The human dimension of this campaign deserves recognition beyond simple statistics of vessels destroyed and missions flown, because the bomber crews faced genuine danger on every mission, with flak and night fighters and navigation challenges creating casualty rates that were sobering even by wartime standards. Squadron leader Fouquier and countless other pilots flew night after night through increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire as German defenses improved and concentrated more guns around the invasion ports, knowing that each mission might be their last, but accepting the risk because the strategic importance of stopping the invasion justified any sacrifice. On the German side, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter and thousands of other workers assigned to preparing the invasion fleet experienced the frustration and danger of trying to complete an impossible task while under nightly bombardment, watching vessels they'd spent weeks preparing destroyed in 90 seconds of bombing, and then having to start over with replacement barges that would likely suffer the same fate. The psychological toll of this grinding attrition affected German morale and efficiency, creating a sense that the invasion preparations were futile exercises that would never culminate in actual operations, because the RAF would simply keep destroying barges faster than they could be assembled and prepared. By October 1940, the strategic situation had shifted decisively against Germany's invasion plans, with Hitler announcing on October 12th that Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely, officially attributed to failure to achieve air superiority, but fundamentally driven by the barge shortage created through 3 months of sustained RAF bombing. The invasion fleet that was supposed to transport 160,000 German soldiers across the Channel to conquer Britain had been reduced through systematic destruction to a level insufficient for the operation, and without adequate transport capacity, the entire invasion concept became impossible regardless of other factors. The final accounting of the barge bombing campaign reveals impressive statistics that demonstrate the effectiveness of focused, strategic bombing against vulnerable targets, with RAF Bomber Command conducting 267 raids between August and October 1940, dropping thousands of tons of bombs and destroying or severely damaging 214 barges, along with extensive port facilities and support infrastructure. British losses totaled 41 aircraft, with 178 crew members killed. Casualties that were significant but sustainable given the strategic importance of preventing German invasion. German losses extended beyond the 214 barges destroyed to include countless hours of labor wasted preparing vessels that were subsequently sunk, disruption to coastal commerce and logistics as ports were repeatedly bombed, and the psychological impact of nightly raids on workers and military personnel who understood they were fighting a losing battle against RAF bombing capabilities. The campaign demonstrated that strategic bombing could achieve concrete military objectives when directed against appropriate targets with adequate resources, providing validation for the concept of using air power to disrupt enemy operations even without achieving air superiority or destroying military forces directly. The question of whether Operation Sea Lion could have succeeded if Germany had assembled sufficient barges and avoided RAF destruction remains a subject of historical debate, with some historians arguing that the invasion was fundamentally impossible, given Royal Navy superiority in the Channel and the Wehrmacht's lack of amphibious warfare experience. The Royal Navy maintained dozens of destroyers and cruisers that could have intercepted invasion barges during the Channel crossing, creating a threat that German planners struggled to address adequately, while the complexity of coordinating simultaneous landings at multiple points along the English coast exceeded Germany's organizational capabilities for this type of operation. But other historians suggest that if Germany had achieved surprise and if weather conditions were perfect, and if the Royal Navy was somehow delayed or misdirected, and if the Luftwaffe provided adequate air cover, then perhaps enough barges might have reached English beaches to establish initial beachheads that could be reinforced before British defenders could respond effectively. 160,000 men crossing in darkness and landing simultaneously at multiple points might have overwhelmed beach defences before the Royal Navy could fully respond, creating at least the possibility of establishing a foothold on English soil. What made invasion definitively impossible by October 1940 was the barge shortage created by RAF bombing, because even if every other obstacle had been overcome, and every other factor had aligned in Germany's favor, they simply didn't have enough vessels to transport the required forces across the Channel. The systematic destruction of 214 barges, plus damage to hundreds of others, had reduced the invasion fleet below the minimum threshold necessary for the operation, making Sea Lion impossible regardless of how perfectly other elements might have been executed. The irony discovered decades later through examination of German planning documents adds an additional layer to the story, revealing that even if Germany had assembled all 1,700 barges and even if RAF bombing had been completely ineffective, the invasion still would likely have failed due to fundamental miscalculations about Channel tidal conditions. The invasion was planned for late September, during spring tides, when currents are particularly strong, and the barges that were designed for calm river conditions couldn't maneuver effectively against Channel currents of 3 to 4 knots, when the barges themselves could only make 4 to 5 knots under power. The net result would have been many barges swept off course and landing in wrong locations or failing to reach shore at all, dissolving the carefully coordinated simultaneous landing into chaos and giving the Royal Navy hours rather than minutes to respond to an invasion force that would have arrived scattered and disorganized and vulnerable. German planners had treated the Channel like a wide river rather than a tidal estuary with complex currents and unpredictable weather patterns, underestimating the maritime challenges in ways that would have doomed the invasion even without RAF interference. The RAF's bombing campaign therefore destroyed barges that probably wouldn't have worked effectively anyway due to these tide and current issues, But the RAF couldn't have known this and operated based on the reasonable assumption that destroying invasion barges was the most direct way to prevent German troops from crossing the Channel. In doing so, they made invasion impossible and saved Britain and won time for the nation to continue fighting, accomplishing all of this through the unglamorous and unheroic but absolutely essential work of bombing barges night after night through flak and weather and darkness. The memorial in Boulogne Harbour today commemorates the RAF aircrew who flew these nightly raids against German invasion barges, with a simple bronze plaque that is weathered and easy to miss, but serves as a reminder that while fighter pilots received glory and recognition for their role in the Battle of Britain, bomber crews who flew the barge bombing missions deserve remembrance for their equally important contribution to stopping Operation Sea Lion. Every year on September 15th, Battle of Britain Day, ceremonies are held with veterans attending when they can, and families laying wreaths and remembering the 41 aircraft lost and 178 men killed in operations that lacked the dramatic appeal of fighter combat, but achieved strategic results that were equally vital to British survival. The strategic bombing campaign that would dominate RAF operations for the next 5 years began conceptually with the barge bombing operations of autumn 1940, proving that bombing could achieve concrete military objectives and providing validation for the theory that air power could disrupt enemy war-making capabilities without requiring direct engagement of military forces. Air Chief Marshal Portal's vision of attacking German industrial centers and oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants to cripple their ability to wage war grew directly from lessons learned during the successful barge bombing campaign. Though subsequent strategic bombing operations would prove far more controversial and costly, with mixed results and enormous casualties and questionable overall effectiveness. But in autumn 1940, the barge bombing campaign represented clear success, stopping an invasion through systematic destruction of enemy transport capacity and demonstrating that focused application of air power against vulnerable targets could achieve results that justified the costs in aircraft and crews. Operation Sea Lion was stopped by 3 forces working in combination, with RAF Fighter Command protecting British airspace, the Royal Navy maintaining control of the Channel, and RAF Bomber Command destroying the invasion barges that were supposed to carry Wehrmacht soldiers to English beaches. And while fighters and ships received most of the historical attention and public recognition, the barge bombers accomplished a mission that was equally essential to preventing German invasion. The crews who flew these missions attacked targets that weren't glamorous or exciting, just barges in harbors night after night. But those missions saved Britain as surely as the Spitfires that fought in daylight and the destroyers that patrolled the Channel in darkness. The tactical evolution of the barge bombing campaign reveals how both sides adapted to changing circumstances and learned from experience. With RAF Bomber Command developing increasingly sophisticated methods for attacking invasion ports, while German defenders improved their anti-aircraft capabilities and developed countermeasures designed to minimize damage from nightly raids. The early raids in August employed relatively straightforward approaches, with bombers attacking from medium altitudes using standard bombing techniques. But as German flak concentrations increased and casualties mounted, tacticians began experimenting with different methods, including low-level attacks, diversionary raids to split defensive fire, and coordinated strikes from multiple directions simultaneously. The Wellington bombers that formed the backbone of the campaign were remarkably resilient aircraft capable of absorbing significant battle damage and still returning to base, with their geodetic airframe construction providing structural redundancy that allowed them to survive hits that would have destroyed aircraft built using conventional methods. Pilots praised the Wellington's ability to keep flying with damaged engines or perforated fuel tanks or sections of wing shot away, though this durability came at the cost of relatively modest speed and climb rate that made the aircraft vulnerable during bombing runs when they flew straight and level while bombardiers aimed their weapons. The Hampden bombers offered better speed and maneuverability than Wellingtons, but carried smaller bomb loads and had defensive armament that pilots considered inadequate for operations over heavily defended targets, making them more suitable for attacks on less protected ports or diversionary raids designed to draw German fighters and flak away from main attacking forces. The Whitley bombers were reliable workhorses capable of long endurance that made them valuable for extended missions, though their relatively slow speed made them vulnerable, and their crews often felt they were flying obsolescent aircraft that should have been replaced with more modern designs. The Blenheim light bombers like the one flown by squadron leader Fouquier were fast and maneuverable compared to heavy bombers, but carried much smaller bomb loads that limited their effectiveness against large target arrays, making them most useful for precision attacks against specific vessels or installations where accuracy mattered more than total explosive weight delivered. Blenheim crews developed considerable pride in their ability to attack targets with precision that heavy bomber crews couldn't match, though they also understood that their light armor and modest defensive armament made them extremely vulnerable if caught by German fighters or concentrated flak. The human experience of these nightly raids involved a complex mixture of boredom, terror, exhaustion, and occasional satisfaction at successful attacks, with crews spending hours in cramped aircraft navigating through darkness and weather to reach target areas where they would face intense anti-aircraft fire during brief bombing runs before turning for home and the long flight back to English bases. The navigation challenges were substantial given the primitive equipment available in 1940, with navigators relying primarily on dead reckoning and occasional visual fixes when clouds permitted observation of ground features, leading to situations where crews sometimes attacked wrong targets or became lost and had to divert to alternate airfields when fuel ran low. The flak over invasion ports grew increasingly heavy as the campaign progressed, and German commanders recognized the threat to their invasion preparations, with 88mm batteries being concentrated around major ports like Boulogne and Calais, until the defensive fire became some of the most intense in Europe outside Germany itself. Bomber crews learned to respect the German gunners' skill and accuracy, understanding that the black puffs of exploding shells represented shrapnel traveling at lethal velocities that could shred aircraft and kill crews in seconds. And the psychological strain of flying repeatedly through heavy flak took a toll that wasn't captured in official casualty statistics, but affected crew performance and morale. The night fighter threat remained relatively modest during the barge bombing campaign because Germany's night fighter force was still developing, and most Luftwaffe fighter units were focused on daylight operations against RAF Fighter Command. But occasional encounters with Bf-10 night fighters reminded bomber crews that they were vulnerable to interception during their long transits to and from target areas. The development of airborne radar for night fighters represented a future threat that would make bomber operations increasingly dangerous. Though in autumn 1940, the technology was still primitive and encounters remained relatively rare compared to the constant danger from anti-aircraft fire. The bomb loads carried by different aircraft types varied significantly and influenced the tactical employment of various squadrons, with heavy bombers like Wellingtons typically carrying 4 500-pound bombs or equivalent weights in smaller weapons, while light bombers like Blenheims might carry 4 250-pound bombs, creating a trade-off between accuracy and total destructive effect. The 500-pound general-purpose bombs proved ideal for attacking barges because they combined sufficient explosive power to destroy wooden vessels with blast effects that could damage multiple targets in close proximity, while incendiary bombs were sometimes mixed into loads to start fires that would spread through densely packed invasion fleets. The timing of raids was carefully planned to maximize effectiveness while managing crew fatigue and aircraft availability, with most missions launching in evening darkness and reaching target areas between midnight and 3 a.m. when German defensive readiness might be reduced due to crew fatigue and when moon conditions provided enough illumination for target identification, but not enough to make bombers easy targets for flak gunners. The moon phase calculations became increasingly sophisticated as the campaign progressed, with operations staff learning to correlate bombing accuracy and casualty rates with lunar conditions and adjusting mission planning accordingly. The debriefing procedures after missions provided critical intelligence about target damage, defensive capabilities, and navigation challenges, with intelligence officers carefully questioning crews about what they observed and experienced during their raids. Bomb damage assessment remained challenging because fires and smoke often obscured results and crews were focused primarily on surviving rather than carefully observing effects of their weapons. But photographic reconnaissance flights, conducted after major raids, provided objective evidence of destruction that could be used to assess campaign effectiveness and plan subsequent operations. The maintenance burden on ground crews became increasingly heavy as the campaign continued, and aircraft returned with battle damage that required repair before they could fly again, with armaments crews working through nights to reload bombs and ammunition, while engine fitters repaired damaged systems and airframe mechanics patched holes and replaced damaged components. The ground crews understood that their work directly affected whether aircraft and crews survived subsequent missions, creating intense pressure to perform repairs quickly and correctly, while dealing with limited spare parts and inadequate facilities at many bomber stations. The strategic impact of the barge bombing campaign extended beyond the immediate destruction of invasion vessels to include disruption of German logistics and port operations more broadly, because the constant threat of nightly raids forced German commanders to disperse vessels and equipment more widely than would otherwise be necessary, reducing efficiency of loading and preparation operations while consuming resources on defensive measures that might otherwise have been devoted to offensive preparations. The psychological impact on German personnel working in invasion ports shouldn't be underestimated, because the knowledge that RAF bombers would come every night regardless of weather or defenses created stress that affected morale and performance across the entire invasion preparation effort. The political dimension of Operation Sea Lion and its cancellation involved complex interactions between Hitler, the Wehrmacht leadership, and various military services that all had different perspectives on the invasion's feasibility and desirability, with the Kriegsmarine remaining skeptical throughout, while the Luftwaffe's Goering promised air superiority that proved impossible to achieve, and the Army developed increasingly elaborate landing plans that assumed maritime challenges would somehow be solved by others. Hitler himself oscillated between enthusiasm for invasion and recognition of the immense risks, ultimately using the failure to achieve air superiority and the barge shortage as justifications for postponement, while preserving the option to revive the plan if circumstances changed. The counterfactual scenarios where Operation Sea Lion proceeds despite RAF bombing damage and other obstacles remain fascinating exercises in historical speculation, because the initial landings might have succeeded in establishing beachheads despite all the challenges, if German forces achieved complete surprise and perfect execution. But sustaining those beachheads and pushing inland would have required continuous reinforcement and resupply across a channel that the Royal Navy controlled, and where German naval forces were inadequate to protect vulnerable transport convoys. The Wehrmacht's impressive performance in continental campaigns might not have translated to amphibious operations where logistics and naval support determined success more than tactical skill or operational doctrine. The impact of weather on potential invasion timing added another layer of uncertainty to German planning, because autumn weather in the Channel is notoriously unpredictable, with sudden storms that can transform calm seas into impossible conditions for small vessels like the barges that formed the invasion fleet's core. The window for acceptable weather conditions was narrow and growing narrower as September progressed into October, adding time pressure to an operation that was already facing insurmountable obstacles from RAF bombing and Royal Navy opposition. And German meteorologists who advised on timing faced impossible demands to predict conditions weeks in advance with accuracy that 1940s forecasting capabilities simply couldn't provide. The role of intelligence in both British understanding of German invasion preparations and German assessment of British defensive capabilities created a complex interplay where each side attempted to divine the other's intentions and capabilities while concealing their own, with the RAF's reconnaissance flights over invasion ports providing critical evidence of barge concentrations that drove the bombing campaign, while German intelligence efforts struggled to assess the true strength of British defences and the likelihood that invasion forces could achieve their objectives. The tendency of military intelligence organizations to provide assessments that confirmed pre-existing beliefs rather than challenging assumptions affected both sides' planning in ways that would only become clear through post-war historical analysis. The experience gained by RAF Bomber Command during the barge bombing campaign proved valuable for subsequent operations, despite the unique characteristics of attacking port targets compared to the strategic bombing missions that would dominate later years. Because crews learned navigation techniques and developed bombing procedures and gained confidence in their ability to find targets and deliver weapons effectively under combat conditions. The relatively successful outcomes of the barge campaign created perhaps excessive optimism about strategic bombing's potential effectiveness against industrial targets in Germany, where defenses would prove much stronger and results much more ambiguous than the clear success of sinking barges in French ports. The commemoration of the barge bombing campaign in British military history has been surprisingly limited, given its decisive importance in preventing German invasion, overshadowed by the more dramatic and photogenic story of RAF Fighter Command's defense during the Battle of Britain, and by the subsequent strategic bombing campaign against Germany that generated more controversy and captured more public attention. The bomber crews who flew nightly missions against invasion ports conducted unglamorous operations that lacked the immediate drama of dogfights over England or the massive raids against German cities, making their story less compelling for popular histories, even though their contribution to British survival was equally vital. The survivors of the barge bombing campaign carried their experiences into post-war lives with a mixture of pride in their accomplishments and frustration at the limited recognition their efforts received, understanding that they had participated in operations that saved Britain from invasion, but rarely receiving the public acknowledgement that fighter pilots enjoyed for their more visible role in the Battle of Britain. Veterans organizations and historical researchers have worked to preserve the story and ensure that the sacrifice of the 178 crew members killed in these operations isn't forgotten by future generations who might otherwise remember only the fighter pilots and overlook the equally important role of bomber crews. The technical details of how bombs destroy barges reveal interesting aspects of the campaign's effectiveness, because direct hits weren't always necessary to achieve destruction, given that the pressure waves from near misses could crack hulls and rupture seams in wooden vessels that weren't designed to withstand the shock loads created by high explosive detonations. The underwater explosions were particularly effective because water transmits pressure waves much more efficiently than air, allowing a single bomb landing between several barges to damage all of them simultaneously through transmitted shock that would crack wooden planking and open seams that would gradually flood the vessels even if they appeared superficially intact. The German efforts to defend invasion ports and mitigate bombing damage involved increasingly sophisticated measures as the campaign progressed and the threat became clear, including camouflage nets over vessel concentrations, dummy barges positioned to draw bombs away from real vessels, increased anti-aircraft concentrations, balloon barrages designed to force bombers higher where bombing accuracy would suffer, and dispersal of vessels to reduce the likelihood that single bombs would destroy multiple targets. These defensive measures achieved some success in reducing the effectiveness of individual raids, but couldn't prevent the cumulative destruction that made invasion impossible by October 1940. The logistics of sustaining the RAF's bombing campaign required extensive ground support infrastructure, including bomb storage facilities at airfields scattered across England, transportation networks to move weapons from factories to bases, fuel supplies for hundreds of sorties nightly, spare parts for maintaining aircraft that returned damaged from raids, and the administrative apparatus to coordinate operations across multiple squadrons attacking different targets. The smooth functioning of this logistical system often went unnoticed, but was absolutely essential to maintaining the operational tempo necessary to inflict unsustainable damage on German invasion preparations. The psychological burden on bomber crews who flew repeated missions into heavily defended target areas represented a form of combat stress that wasn't well understood in 1940, but would later be recognized as a serious issue affecting operational effectiveness, with some crew members developing symptoms that today would be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, but were then dismissed as lack of moral courage or inadequate discipline. The RAF's policy of completing 30 operational missions before granting leave or reassignment to training duties meant that crews faced extended periods of regular combat exposure that tested psychological resilience in ways that affected individuals differently depending on personality and circumstances. The evolution of German invasion planning documents reveals how Operation Sea Lion became increasingly elaborate and complex, as more detailed analysis revealed additional challenges, with initial optimistic assessments giving way to recognition that the operation faced fundamental obstacles that might prove insurmountable even under favorable conditions. The documents captured after the war show German planners grappling with problems ranging from tide calculations to supply logistics to command and control during landing operations, with each solution creating new complications that made the entire enterprise appear progressively less feasible as planning matured. The role of the barge bombing campaign in Operation Sea Lion's cancellation was decisive but not singular, because the operation faced multiple obstacles, any one of which might have proven fatal, including the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority, the Royal Navy's continued control of the Channel, the Wehrmacht's lack of amphibious warfare experience, and the fundamental unsuitability of river barges for channel crossings. The RAF's systematic destruction of barges ensured that even if all other obstacles had somehow been overcome, the invasion couldn't proceed due to insufficient transport capacity, making the bombing campaign the definitive barrier that transformed Operation Sea Lion from difficult to impossible. The long-term strategic implications of Britain's survival in 1940 extended far beyond the immediate prevention of German invasion to include the maintenance of a base from which Allied forces would eventually launch the liberation of Europe, the continuation of British industrial production that supported the war effort, and the preservation of an ally for the United States when America entered the war in December 1941. If Operation Sea Lion had succeeded and Britain had been forced to surrender or negotiate peace, the entire trajectory of World War II would have changed in ways that would have favored Germany and made eventual Allied victory much more difficult, if not impossible. The barge bombing campaign of 1940 therefore represents not just a tactical success in destroying enemy equipment, but a strategic victory that preserved Britain's ability to continue fighting and ultimately helped determine the war's outcome. Accomplished through the unglamorous and unheroic but absolutely essential work of bomber crews who flew night after night through flak and weather to attack barges in French ports. The memorial in Boulogne harbour and the annual ceremonies on Battle of Britain Day serve to remind future generations that while fighter pilots deservedly receive glory for their role in defending Britain, the bomber crews who destroyed the invasion fleet deserve equal recognition for their critical contribution to British survival and eventual Allied victory in World War II.